you're dialing in from today so we can acknowledge the traditional owners. So welcome everyone to this special edition, Startmate and Blackbird Ventures Giants Weekly. My name is Lauren Kaplan and I'm principal at Startmate, the epicenter of startup ambition across Australia and New Zealand. We run mentor-led cohort-based programs right across the startup community stack, from founder to operator to investor, with our accelerator, fellowship, and first believers programs. My co-host today is the wonderful Melia Rayner from Blackbird. She's community and communications manager there. And Blackbird is a venture capital fund that invests in wild hearts with the wildest ideas right at the very beginning. Based in Australia and New Zealand, Blackbird invests in every type of technology from software to space and unified by the biggest ambitions. One of the core beliefs at both Blackbird and Startmate is that founders are the best people to support founders. And that's why we're excited to have today's guest joining us. Justin Khan is the co-founder of Twitch, the world's biggest live streaming platform. He's been a serial entrepreneur and technology investor at Combinator and his new fund, Goat Capital. Justin is also the host of The Quest, a podcast that brings the world of the stories who've struggled to find their own purpose, made it in the outside world, and then found deeper meaning beyond success. Welcome, Justin.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
I'm going to dive into the questions with you, Justin, but we'll leave some time at the end for you, our listeners, to actually have some of your burning questions answered as well. So do pop them in the chat as we go along, and Melia will surface the best ones near the end of the session. So Justin, I'd love you to sort of wind back the clock, take us back to 2007. YouTube is kind of 2 years old. Facebook's just 1 year older than that. Instagram is but a twinkle in Kevin Systrom's eye. And for some reason, you decide it's the right time to mount a camera and mic on a baseball cap and start streaming your life 24/7. Can you tell us what was behind that move and what did you set out to actually create when you started live casting through JustinTV?
Sure. Yeah. So it wasn't really a well thought out idea in a way. It was a startup kind of like nominally, but we didn't have like a business plan of like how it's going to make money. We thought, okay, maybe this can be something that happens on the internet and people will come watch it, and maybe it will somehow become successful, kind of question mark, and then profit, right? We started off as, we were already founders because Emmett and I had started a company, my co-founder and I, who's my childhood best friend, started a company that was like a kind of like Google Calendar before Google Calendar came out in 2006. And unfortunately, it was a much worse product in basically every way. So that company failed. We ended up in this crazy Hail Mary selling it on eBay and actually made money, surprisingly. And then we were looking for another idea, like another startup idea to do, and went over to our mentor, Paul Graham's house, who's the founder of Y Combinator, and we were pitching him an idea that wasn't JustinTV. It was actually an idea around like a publishing startup. And Paul hated it. He hated the idea. So he was like, what else do you have? And so I kind of reached into my back pocket of like crazy ideas. And I was like, okay, I have this idea for JustinTV, which is this thing that we call this show we want to make about our lives, starting a startup where we just stream everything to the internet, like 24/7. It's mobile. So like wherever I go, I'm walking around the street and like you can see like my point of view. And we didn't even really know if it was technically possible or not at the time. We were engineers, but there's no iPhone, there's no real live streaming sites on the internet. So we just pitched him this idea and it was like, okay, that's interesting. This could be a new form of reality TV, and this could, be a new form of entertainment on the internet. And he starts pitching it back to us basically, and how it's like going to be really big. And so we were like, okay, he's like pretty excited about this. And the kind of turning point was one of the other partners at YC, one of the co-founders of YC, Robert Morris, who's this professor of computer science at MIT, was like, happened to be there at Paul's house. And he said, I'll fund it just to see you make a fool of yourself, Justin. And so we literally walked out of there with a check for $50,000. And then we were like, I guess we're on the hook to figure out how to make this actually work technically. And so most of our effort was actually spent on that, like building this, like, it was very complex, like multiple cell phone modems. And there's like a computer that, took video from this analog camera, streamed it to multiple cell phone modems, and then like reassembled it on the back end and then streamed it out to the internet. And we had to kind of build all these different parts of the technology stack to make it happen. And then we launched this show, and that was the thinking. We had spent almost all this time. We had spent all the time thinking about the technology and almost none of the time thinking about like what makes a good piece of content actually. or what makes the show interesting. And so consequently, the show was like awful because it's like me just sitting there on my computer programming the website or like trying to be entertaining or whatever, but there was really only a couple minutes a day maybe that was like gold, and then the rest of it, was like incredibly boring. It's like someone's normal life. And so I mean, the long story short is people came, they were like, this sucks, your content. It was such a novelty. People showed up, they came from like Reddit or Dig or like all these different sites in the news, and they were like, what's going on with this guy? And then they were like, this show sucks, entertain us. And then they would kind of interject themselves in our lives in very horrible ways, like calling the cops on us or ordering like a nonstop stream of pizzas to our house. But then they also said, some portion of the users were like, I want to create my own stream. How are you doing this? And so we were like, oh, we spent all this time building this technology stack. Maybe we should turn it into a platform for anyone to broadcast live video. And that's what we did. And then that was kind of how we launched our real startup, which was JustinTV. I mean, it's very unintentional and circuitous, but that's how it happened.
That's fascinating. And just before I move on to kind of the opening up of the platform, were there any particularly memorable moments that you found yourself in kind of live streaming to the world, what events or whatever it might have been that actually were the content that people were coming for?
Yeah, I mean, there was some fun stuff. Like we got in, because it was so novel, like I got invited to a lot of stuff. Like, I remember that someone threw like a party on Alcatraz, like a brand. I think it was Toyota, maybe, like this brand, like sorry, a party on Alcatraz. I got to go to this like party that I would never have been. I mean, I was a 22-year-old like new graduate from, I would never have been able to go to this party, and it was like pretty cool to like see them like do this really big event. And I got invited to that. I got invited to all these different things, which were cool, or like, had some fun interactions with fans like on the street, or like, I remember I was walking around, I was like, this is ridiculous. I went and bought like a Chronicle, the SF Chronicle, the newspaper at the time, like did a full front page cover thing. I'm like, this guy's like streaming his life to the internet. And like, that was when people like actually bought newspapers. So I went and got one, and I was like, this is ridiculous. And I said, someone should just register. We should have called our show undeservedfame.com. And then somebody actually registered that and linked it, and 301 redirected it to our site, like while I was saying it. That was the kind of live interactivity with the fans, and I just thought it was, that was pretty cool. But overall, it was not that engaging. There were just these golden moments.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess that's representative of social media in general as it evolved. So you set out to create something, and obviously that conversation with Paul, kind of, there was a bigger vision in mind, and maybe the first part of it wasn't necessarily thought out from a content strategy perspective. But how did you know it was the right time to actually blow it open to other users, other live streamers, live casters, and actually move into this kind of multiple channel strategy that JustinTV ended up becoming?
Yeah, so I mean, it was kind of like there's this huge spike of traffic, and then it immediately started falling off, and we could read the writing on the wall. We were like, this show is not good. Like, we're living it, and we're like, this is not that good of a show. So we need to do something to get more traffic. And we still were like very many steps away from like making money, right? We were like, if we get traffic, then we could figure out some way to make money, but like we need to get more traffic. And at the time, like all the traffic we were getting was losing money because we were paying for these like pretty high bandwidth costs. But we were like, okay, we just need to grow our traffic. So how are we going to do that? And we ended up deciding like to open it up out of desperation, basically. But it took us 6 months to actually like retool all the software to make it like work for other people. So it was if we were smarter, we'd have launched the show and had this platform ready to go that we just turned on after we got all this traffic. But we kind of had to go back to the drawing board and like rebuild it. So it wasn't until like October 2007 that we launched it as a platform.
And what was the uptake like at that point? Were there people just ready to go and had kind of bought into this concept, or was there actually an education process to get new users onboarded?
Yeah, people were pretty into it. It was like back, I think now there's like a little bit of fatigue around like software, like consumer software. There's like, there's tons and tons of apps, and people are making new apps all the time. So convincing someone to try your app is like a little bit harder. But at the time, there was no way to broadcast live video to the internet. Really, there were a couple of small startup competitors, but we were all starting like literally at the same time, kind of like, 1 month to the next. And so nobody knew, people who wanted to broadcast something live, like do any sort of live thing, like, if we were doing this panel or something back in 2007, like there was no way to do it except for trying JustinTV. So there were a lot of people who were interested in just trying it out. And, so we had celebrities like the Jonas Brothers, I remember, hopped on early to try it out, to people broadcasting sports games, to people broadcasting, their own talk show or podcast or whatever. It was kind of a mix of stuff, to video games, which was, obviously what we eventually became our bread and butter with Twitch.
Yeah, so I will go into Twitch in a second, but I also just want to kind of chronologically pause here as well. What you're talking about is this kind of really early stage of the next wave of technology in San Francisco, globally, however you want to put it. What else was going on around this time? You did, as you mentioned, come through Y Combinator with a different startup sort of in 2005, Kiko Calendar, and that was actually the first batch of YC. So, this novelty factor of new ideas, changing the game, changing industries was, you were very much at the epicenter of that. What are some of the things you remember about that really nascent time of the Silicon Valley we know today?
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a fun time to be young in Silicon Valley, because I was 23 years old when we started JustinTV, and so we didn't know anything. Like, we were very, really didn't know anything. Like, I would never manage anyone, like didn't know how to raise money, didn't know how to, like, there was not as much of a infrastructure around startups. Right now there's like this global infrastructure around startups, and like a lot of the material that YC has put out, and then people put their own spins on it. And then you have, like, anywhere you go, like you can have Startmate in Australia that can help you like figure out how to like start your company. And there's like standard things like safes and standard ways that people invest. But that didn't really exist as much. There was like, standards around VC rounds, but how you got from like nothing to a VC round was like very much a black box, right? And it was like there were not well-known, methodologies and metrics around that. And so it was kind of like this frontier feeling. Also, there weren't that many startups in San Francisco. Actually, most of them at the time were in Silicon Valley, which, the SF Bay is this like large geographic region. And so they were like in the suburbs, basically. So in the city, which is like where the young people wanted to live, but there weren't really any startups. We kind of got started there. We're in this building called Crystal Tower, which is this apartment building that would lease month to month to like people who were 22 years old. So we moved in there, and then all these different founders kind of moved into this startup. So the founders of like Dropbox or Scribd, which is a pretty big book sharing company, to the founders of like Reddit and this company Weebly that just got acquired by Square a couple of years ago. So like all of these different companies that went on to be pretty successful, the founders like lived in this building, and we were just like, it was kind of like a college dorm, like people just hacking out of their bedroom, and then, just going at night, like just comparing notes or shooting the shit or drink together or whatever. And it did feel like this kind of, it wasn't like an attractive job proposition. Like people didn't want to be a startup founder back then, or they didn't even want to work at startups. So it was more of like the people who really were there for a reason. Like the reason might be like they couldn't get another job somewhere else, or they were like really interested in technology, or just like, but it was people who were there for a reason. Now the industry is a lot more mature, and like it's the best career path to go get a job at, technology company after college, oftentimes, for people. So, it's a little bit different.
I mean, hindsight is 2020, but and obviously you were very young at the time, but do you think you had a sense when you were kind of looking around the room, people like Steve Huffman and Reddit came through that same first YC class as yours? Was there this palpable sense that these people would go on to create some of these most significant businesses that have emerged over the last decade or so, or was it just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks?
Yeah, absolutely not. Like if you knew Steve Huffman when he was 23 years old, you would not be like, this is the guy who's going to make, one of the biggest websites and communities in the world. And yeah, for sure. No way. Like, one of my co-founders, Michael Seibel, who's now the CEO of YC. So he runs the YC program. YC is like, this global phenomenon now, 350 companies every batch. It's like thousands and thousands of companies, probably almost 10,000 founders now, I'm sure. More like, I think 40% of the batch is now international outside the US. So it's like really becoming, startups, I think, are this really global phenomenon, which is amazing. I think a huge, kind of an amazing testament to kind of the seed that started in Silicon Valley. But at the time, so he used to ask me, he was like, I remember asking me one time, like, why were there so many successful founders that came out of our like little cluster, like the guys from Airbnb or Dropbox or Reddit, ourselves were probably like at the bottom of this stack, but whatever. And so he's like, man, we knew all these like geniuses back then. It's like so random, right? And I'm like, No, they're not geniuses. These are like smart people who were in the right place at the right time, but there's a little bit of a selection bias where, you know, if you just built something on the internet is growing so fast, like that if one person wanted it in 2006, then that means probably like tens of thousands of people want it today, right? If 10,000 people wanted it in 2006, then there's like, millions and millions and millions of people who want it today. So like almost anything, if you just stuck around, could become a company that was successful.
Yeah, it's super interesting because that concept of senius, which I think Kevin Kelly has written about as well, it's like right place, right time, right people, and the moment kind of caught fire. But I agree, like in this kind of COVID era where everything's become hybrid, how we start to see that distributed across the world is the next most exciting part. So I'll jump back into just Justin TV, and I guess you were just reflecting on the fact that gaming became the most, I guess, concentrated channel or vertical across the platform, which then eventually spun off to be what we know now today as Twitch. At what point did you decide to split that part of the business off as opposed to kind of just evolving Justin TV to kind of cater towards that particular demographic? How did you know that kind of live streaming gaming was going to be such a big opportunity?
Well, once again, we did not know at all. But what happened was we grew Justin TV for like 4 years. Yeah, and it grew and grew and grew and became pretty big. It was like a top 250 website in the world, but then it stopped growing, and whatever we tried, like it wouldn't grow anymore. And so we're like, the writing's on the wall. If the internet's growing and your thing's not growing on the internet, then you're relatively shrinking, and that just means that you're like one step away from falling off a cliff, and that your company's going to die. And so that's what we feared. And so we decided, okay, we need to do something different. And we, as founders, like the four founders of the company, myself, Michael, Emmett, and Kyle, these were my co-founders who were, we were all young when we started. So no one really had any experience. We didn't know what we were doing. We just sat in a room. We just brainstormed ideas. And Emmett was the one who came up with, who's my, co-founder of Kiko, my last company, one of my closest friends. He just came up with this idea. He was like, I want to watch the gaming streams. That's the only content I care about on our site. Our site sucks, basically, is what he's saying. But this is like the only content I like, and we should focus on this. And my co-founder Michael was like, no, we should build a video app that's like for mobile. So it's like focused on mobile, because mobile is going to be this huge wave. This is back in 2011. So, or 2010, really, when we were talking about this. So, iPhone's 3 years out, there's mobile apps, but it isn't the same as it is today, where, and he's like, mobile is going to be huge. So we should work on video for mobile. And we couldn't decide. And so we decided to not decide and just do both projects internally. So we kind of incubated Twitch and then this other app that became this company called Social Cam, which we eventually sold to Autodesk for $60 million. But the main thing was like, we were working on Twitch inside of Justin TV. And it did start as us just working on the Justin TV gaming category and just trying to boost gaming on Justin TV. And then eventually that got so big that we said, okay, it deserves to be its own site. So then we made it its own site, but we're still running Justin TV. And then the resources just transferred over, like more and more every month, until it was like 4 people working on Justin TV and like 150 people working on Twitch.
So is that how big it was at its height from a team perspective before you went through the acquisition?
That's about the size, yeah, when we went through the acquisition. Yeah.
Fantastic. And it's just incredible to think about how that category has continued to grow and the kind of professionalization of that whole space as well. I know there's a bunch of Twitch fans in our current Startmate cohort, and one of the founders, Jax from GGWP Academy, essentially runs an education academy helping young gamers kind of build out their business from a streaming sponsorship and kind of brand building perspective. So it's just an idea not before its time, but at exactly the right moment in its growth, which is very cool.
Yeah, we rode this big wave, right? Like we didn't create the gaming wave, but Emmett correctly identified it, and then we rode it, and became bigger than we ever thought. And the kind of funny thing was, like, back with our very first startup, Kiko, we were competing with, we had this calendar, and it was like pretty cool calendar, and then Google came out and it was like way better in every way, right? Google Calendar. And I was like, the next thing we do, we never want to compete with Google. And so then we start Justin TV, and we're like, no, there's no way that this could ever compete with Google. Like, Google's not going to have a reality live show or whatever. Then it turned into this live platform, and then YouTube like launched live, and then we were like, okay, we're going to have this gaming platform, right? And then eventually YouTube is like, has this live. They put all this resources and money into this live gaming platform, like on YouTube as part of, it's like kind of like a section of YouTube, and we're like, fuck.
So is the message there, don't worry about competing with YouTube because eventually you will be, sorry, with Google because eventually you will be, or,
Yeah,
what's the message there?
I guess the learning, yeah, what's the learning? The learning is probably that you need to, um, you've got to kind of skate to where the puck is going, right? Like you got to go and build the future. And I think with Kiko, it was like too obvious. Like there was already Gmail, and so there was like the calendars next. It was probably in retrospect like very obvious for them to be working on. Whereas like live video on the internet was probably, if someone was, amazing prognosticator, that would be like, okay, that is going to happen eventually. But it wasn't super obvious that it was going to happen anytime soon. And so we were like doing something that was like much where we could build up like much more of a head start, on the kind of incumbents. And that's something for startup founders to think about today, because now the FANG companies are like, the big companies, the tech giants have so many resources and so much money that they're doing everything. And so you really have to figure out like what is, far away from these guys, like to, to really build something that I think can be like a breakout company.
Yeah, that's great advice, and certainly what I know Blackbird is always looking for, and certainly Startmate looking to support as well. So many of the people in the room today are part of some of the Blackbird Giants Academy or Startmate, Australia's longest running accelerator program. Not as old as YC, but we've just hit a decade last year, so there's a bit of a lineage there. But you actually, as we've talked about with Kiko, you actually went through YC 3 separate times. The reason Paul Graham was a mentor by the time you were doing JustinTV was because of that Kiko calendar experience. Then you came through with JustinTV and then Exec as well, which was the kind of offline errand marketplace around 2012. Which is a phenomenal story. And I think sometimes, it's not so common in Australia yet to think about doing an accelerator more than once. I would just love to know what were some of those most valuable experiences that you had through your time at Y Combinator, and then of course you became involved later as a partner as well, but particularly from a founder perspective.
Yeah, well, I think, in the beginning, the valuable experience, which I think has changed a little bit now, but maybe, maybe a little bit, but not, there's still, founding is like a very isolating experience, right? Like most people are not, um, founders, being a founder is a solo journey. You're going through with your co-founders. You don't really have that many people to talk to. And the novel thing about YC was like, just do, fund all these people at the same time. And then they meet once a week and you kind of make friends. It's like college or something, but everybody's working on the same, it's like your major. If you're like majoring in, I was a physics undergrad, and like I'd have people to work on problem sets with, right? Cause I just my classmates. And so it's almost like Y Combinator's novelty was like, okay, all these startups are kind of in batches, right? Obviously they don't line up perfectly, but they're all working on it at the same time. And so get to know each other and like be a network to support each other. And that was huge, for a bunch of different reasons. But it was really the mentorship and friend group and just knowing that people are going through the same experience that you're going through. So that was valuable in the beginning. And then in the later stages, what was more valuable was just for the second or third time was like, oh, I want to instill the DNA of like moving really quickly in my company. So doing an accelerated program is a way to like say, oh, we have 10 weeks to really make some significant amount of progress. It's kind of an artificial constraint, right? But I think it helps create that DNA of moving quickly in the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's, you can learn it once and ideally you would be able to repeat it, but there's something about that forcing function of being in that cohort model. Yes, you may have built the relationship with the mentors over time, but there's something about that kind of cohort constraint that boosts people along, which I think is really interesting. We have actually had in the history of Startmate one founder, a group of founders who've come through twice, and that actually is Propeller Aero, which has become one of the most successful Startmate companies. So I think there is this value in founders who recognize the discipline and sort of come back in and go through again. So it makes a lot of sense. And from your perspective later on, when you got involved more as a kind of partner and investor at YC, how did you start to hone that insight around, you were around Steve Huffman at 23, maybe you couldn't tell then what a great founder looked like before they were so, but what became the indicators for you that a founder did have something special and could turn their idea into something significant?
Well, the interesting thing about YC is it's a little bit different. And, at Startmate, you probably see the same thing than being like maybe a venture investor where you're deploying, like you're writing like $1 million check or $5 million check or something like that. Because at YC, you don't know, you actually really don't know. And in a way, the lesson of YC is like, you can't know. And so we're doing like more of an index fund approach, right? And or maybe it's not a full true, it's not it's not a huge index, but it's like some index. And so the things that are interesting about YC is like we funded the companies that applied, and so the types of companies we put out RFPs sometimes, or RFSs, requests for startups, but sometimes mostly it'd be just who applied and which ones did we think are interesting. And so the trends follow like the types of companies that founders want to start, right? Like when and sometimes it's like there's a little bit of Me Tooism, but sometimes it's like really riding a wave. Like crypto, for example, was Bitcoin is happening. There's all this innovation in crypto, so like Coinbase applied, and then Filecoin applied, and there's and then now there's a lot of startups from India because India's tech ecosystem is really growing, and so the trends follow the startups follow these global trends. And what we were doing at YC was just saying, okay, who are the people who like can they explain this in a novel in a way that I understand, I, the like layperson, can understand? Do they seem like they're passionate about it? Do they seem like they can build it and execute on it? We're doing this over a very short period of time, right? It's like at the time it was like a 10-minute interview after maybe a pre-screen and reading their application. So it's like a very short decision, but just really getting that sense of it. And then you're making a lot of bets, and some of them pay, the one Airbnb pays for the whole thing. And so it's a little bit, I think that if from the YC perspective, there's those are some of the factors that we look for, and those are kind of the things that we think are correlated, or we thought were correlated with like being successful. But you're always surprised. Like there's companies that you thought were like after immediately afterward you admitted you regretted it, and then they like turn on to be successful. Or people you thought were going to be really successful turn out not to be, right? So there's pretty high variance at that early stage. So in the later, now as an investor, like more of like a VC investor, we're making far less bets. It is really trying to dig into, I guess, the same questions, but really get a lot more diligence on it. Like, what is this market? And like, what are the thematics around why we think this market is set to change? And then like, why is this specific person or the people who are going to like really build this company and be dedicated to it? And like I guess you're just trying to dig in a lot more into it,
Yeah, I want to come towards your kind of GOAT capital experience in a little bit, but I just to wrap up the kind of entrepreneurial journey and also what you're working on now. Obviously, like every serial entrepreneur, there are things that don't work out as planned. Would love you to kind of reflect on any of the key learnings that you got out of the experience with Atrium.
Sure. Yeah. So most of the companies I've started have failed, or the more than half, right? Like I've had some like really great wins. Like obviously Twitch and social cameras companies we spun out, and I incubated this company called Alto, which is a pharmacy company that's in the U.S. U.S. pharmacy company that's we've raised $350 million. It's like 900 person company now. It's like it serves over 100,000 patients. So there's some real big successes, but I would say like half of the other companies I've started failed because there's probably a couple of reasons behind that. One is like I'm interested in new things like constantly, so I'm oftentimes like some serial entrepreneurs, they crank like another thing, the second iteration of their old product or like another thing in the same industry, and they're probably going to be successful at that because they like have the experience. But for me, I'm like always interested in learning about new industries and new businesses, and I think sometimes my hypothesis is wrong on like what will work, and so that's one thing. The second thing that's maybe important is like I think it's really important to work on what you're intrinsically motivated to do. And so the question I ask myself now is like, what would I do if nobody knew about it and I wasn't getting paid and nobody watched it or listened to it? What would I just do for free, for fun, in the dark? And so that's the stuff I want to do. Before, I think I was really chasing a lot of extrinsic motivation. So it was like, what can I do that's going to get me to be a successful entrepreneur, or seen as a successful entrepreneur, or make money or whatever. And the problem with that is like when it's not working super well, like your motivation dries up pretty quickly, and I think for a founder, as a founder, you have to be really dedicated to like driving through those really tough times, because there's always going to be life's a roller coaster, and you're always going to be at the bottom at some moments.
Yeah, I've heard it said that especially for first-time founders, their identity is kind of inextricably linked with the company they're trying to create. So that's where failure hits a lot harder because it seems like a failure of the person. But I guess once you've started to build that muscle of, test and learn as opposed to considering it a failure, the opportunities open up more. And perhaps, as you say, it's super insightful. You refine what it is that you're actually most motivated intrinsically to be working on.
Yeah, so I was like that, right? Like I was very ego attached to my startup, and it was like, if this fails, then I'm like, I would be destroyed as a person, right? Like, and that's not
It's fair to
healthy,
say that
first of
would be
all.
the era of, that time in Silicon Valley as well. I think that would be
Yeah,
speaking for a lot of founders, right?
for sure, for sure. A lot of founders are like that, and in a way, it's useful. I'm not saying it's not useful. In a way, it's useful because it motivates you to work really hard. The problem that the difficulty with that attitude is that you're not very resilient, and you take things personally, and you are not objective in your decision making oftentimes. And so when you're able to extract your ego, like not do things from a place of ego, but do things from a place of joy, and extract your ego from this, and just be like, okay, you can make better decisions. You can make decisions on like what you should actually do, and like, you can, instead of being driven from a place of fear, you can often say, okay, like, let me just look at this rationally and decide what I want to do. And I think you unlock a lot of power when you are able to step away from your ego.
That's a perfect segue to my next question. Your main focus today, or one of your focus areas, is your new podcast, Quest, which I've heard you describe in an episode as or you'd heard it described to you rather as the Zen How I Built This, which is a perfect framing, and I think something that we're starting to see more of in the sense of, looking at the whole person as a founder rather than just the business they're creating, and the stories that go into making these great businesses. Tell us more about, I guess, the insight for that. Was this a kind of COVID pandemic era project that's become something more? And what are you hoping to achieve with these stories you're focusing on?
Yeah, so I started this podcast during COVID, like 7 months ago, something like that. I really just wanted to communicate the things that I wish that I had known when I was starting off as a, not even just a founder, but person in life, a human being. And so I just started telling the stories of friends of mine. If we've had like Michael Seibel, CEO of like Combinator, on the podcast, or Steve Huffman from Reddit, or friends of mine who play basketball, or two DJs from the Chainsmokers, the electronic music duo. And we just, I like to tell people stories, because people from the outside, it always looks like, oh, these guys just, it was like they had a great idea, and then it was a straight shot to the top, or something like that, like with the guys from the Chainsmokers, like they released that song Selfie, and then it was like their career was like to the moon from there. But behind the scenes, there's all these things that people struggle with. For me, I struggled with being depressed at times in my startup, or I linked my ego to my company, and that caused me to I self-medicate drinking like a lot when things weren't going well. Or I've had other friends who have had serious depression through their startups. And so I wanted to just tell the story. And these are people who have like created unicorn companies that are like, everyone like heralds them as like an amazing paragon, kind of like the paragon of Silicon Valley, something like that. So I just wanted to tell the stories behind the story that you hear, and really show that like, one, like everybody goes through kind of this ups and downs, and that's the human experience. And then the second thing is like, here are the things I've learned that have helped me, uh, level up. And it wasn't, I always thought the things that would help me level up were like extrinsic. They were like, okay, I'm going to have a big startup and make a lot of money and have a lot of Twitter followers or something like that. But then I realized through my own self-work, it was like, oh, if I invest in myself and like invest in just having a great day every day, that's like the thing that's really powerful. And so, there's things like meditation and gratitude, and exercise, and really just like very basic stuff. And so that's often, those themes come up in my podcast a lot, where I talk to people about their daily habits and their self-care and wellness routines. And that's kind of like a big interest area of mine.
And based on, I guess, some of those more profound insights, what are some of your favorite episodes that you've recorded so far for everyone listening to kind of dive in and check out?
Yeah, well, so I just did one with an Australian founder, which a good friend of mine, his name's Moses Lowe. He's the founder and CEO of this company called Zendit, which is a payment startup, kind of like the Stripe for Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And that one's pretty good because he's someone in the journey right now. He's someone experiencing this journey. The company's pretty successful, but they're not like, he hasn't sold it. They haven't, it's, um, he's still on the journey. So I liked that one. But then there's other ones that I think some of the ones that people really like and I loved recording were the ones where it's old friends of mine. So it's like Steve Huffman from Reddit, and we talk about quitting drinking alcohol. Both of us are so sober now, which is, if you'd known us 10 years ago, you'd never have guessed that would be even possible. So that was like a really great one. And I actually really like the one with the Chainsmokers because these guys really approached their music career like very entrepreneurially. Like they were very systematic about it. They tried a lot of things that didn't work before they became successful. And so we kind of talk about that. That was fun. I did one with Mark Cuban, which was pretty fun the other day, where he taught me about NFTs actually. And I went on to I started a YouTube channel a couple of months ago and went on to mint my YouTube videos as NFTs and like sell them on OpenSea, which is kind of fun. So I don't know. I love learning, and I find the podcast to be a vehicle to learn from people.
And separately, I guess, on your own journey, any resources or things that you've listened to, read that have really helped with your own kind of self-awareness journey as a founder?
For sure, there's a lot of resources. One book I recommend is this book called Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's pretty popular, so I'm probably just one of many people recommending it, but it really made me think that habit formation was something that was possible. Like before, I thought, oh, I'm just who I am. I can't change like my habits, but some of the techniques in the book that he outlines really helped me develop like a pretty good system of habits. And I'm like not someone who I think of as a high willpower person. Other people think like, oh, you must be like so capable of kind of deciding what you want to do and just doing it. But like I was always someone who was a procrastinator, like struggled working out, whatever. And I tried to sit for meditation and like couldn't do it. For example, I couldn't like sit still for 2 minutes. And through like some of the techniques in the book, I've sat in meditation every day for the last 2 years, or done my gratitude journal every day for 3 years, just because of some of the strategies that he teaches in the book. So I highly recommend that. There's a book called The Untethered Soul, which was very helpful to me, which is kind of it's by this guy who was a CEO of a company, WebMD actually, and then he kind of became I guess, spiritual author. And the book is pretty great. It introduces a lot of kind of Eastern concepts, philosophical concepts to a Western audience. But that one was really meaningful too. And it's a pretty short book.
Yeah, awesome. Great
so yeah,
recommendations. Thank you. Yeah, Atomic
Yeah.
Habits is definitely a fan favorite across the Blackbird and Startmate team as well. And just a fun fact on the quest, you've actually been on a bit of a hiring spree out of Australia. Your team is actually 4 students from the University of Sydney. How did that come about, and what are you seeing in terms of talent from down under?
Yeah, well, kind of happened accidentally. So I started this podcast like 7 months ago, and then so just to test that I was like very intrinsically motivated, I produced it, I created it, and I would put the episodes out there, but I didn't promote it like at all, And so after a while, I was like, okay, I'm really enjoying doing this. I should probably try to see if I can get more people to listen. And I was part of this server called Gen Z Mafia, which is this like Discord server, which I love. That's like all these young builders all around the world, like people are building startups and other stuff. And so I posted in that server. I was like, oh, does anyone want to help me with? I'm looking for someone to hire someone to help me with like promoting my podcast, basically, and doing like being the producer of the podcast. And so this young law school student at the time, Brent Liang, he reached out and we just started talking about it, and this really clicked. And so I was like, okay, you should come do this. And now he's dropped out, which I guess I'm responsible for, to like work on my podcast full time, which is great. And then he has basically hired a bunch of his friends. He was a previous startup founder, and he hired a bunch of his friends and to like work on this podcast. So we have a whole production team, which is pretty cool.
That's very cool. I'm long Gen Z in terms of talent, so it's great to hear how you're plugging into that network. They're going to do amazing things.
Yeah, I love. I'm like really big on hanging out with young people, which in the wrong context that would sound super sketchy, but like like I love I love talking to young people, like people who are like in the early 20s, because they, your mind crystallizes over time. It like becomes less plastic. And one of the things I think is really important as an investor, I mean, it's really important to me personally, primarily, but then I think it's incidentally important as an investor, is that you need to like be thinking about ways to keep an open and curious mind, and a mind that's like open to new ideas. And that is, you're fighting entropy. Like that's the natural, the natural state of the human experience, is that you actually become more closed-minded over time. And so for me, there's a lot of different things I do to try to facilitate that. But one of them is to like spend time with people who like don't have experience, but have a lot of passion and ideas and energy.
That's also great advice. I've got one more question that I'd love to ask before I hand over to Melia, because I know there's some excellent questions coming through the chat, which we will certainly not be able to deal with all of them, unfortunately. But in amongst all of this, you've become a prolific angel investor, and you're now investing through your own fund, Goat Capital, which you're positioning as a hybrid kind of incubator and venture fund. What's exciting you at the moment? Are you looking at creator economy trends based on your experience with JustinTV and Twitch, or are there other thematics that you're pursuing?
Yeah. So there's 4 areas that we're pretty excited about. The first is climate change, and that's a pretty broad category, but we encompass a lot of like, that can be anything from carbon recapture technologies to like consumer products that are much more sustainable and kind of use less energy. So we think that's a big trend, and the big trend really is that good founders want to work on this problem because it's the biggest problem facing humanity, right? And so you want to go to where the good founders are, one, but we also like, I mean, I think funding these kinds of companies is just more exciting in a way. You feel like you're really doing something good for the world. So, we funded a company that's called Living Carbon, for example, that genetically engineers trees to take more carbon out of the atmosphere, sequester more carbon from the atmosphere. So it's like big ideas, exciting ideas like that are pretty fun for us. So that's one. The second is probably is AI and robotics. So I was an investor in Cruise, the self-driving car company that was founded by my brother and one of my Twitch co-founders. And ever since then, I've been like, what are the other applications of AI and robotics in the world to, make things more efficient, lower cost, improve our industrial processes. And so I've had some success with that as an angel investor, and now just trying to continue that. And then digital commerce and creator economy, I would put kind of in one bucket, which is that's my background, I guess, as a entrepreneur, and so interested in that. And then the last is like healthcare. So through some of my experiences, primarily with Alto and then some other companies, have become a little bit of a healthcare investor. And it's kind of one of the biggest industries in America and facing the world. So it's something that I'm excited about investing in.
Super exciting, and some great thematics there. Just for the founders in the room, do you invest internationally, or are you focused on US specific deal
Yeah,
flow
no,
at
we
the
invest
moment?
internationally, actually,
Okay.
quite a bit. Probably 40% of our portfolio is international. You go where the founders are, right? And the
Yeah.
opportunity. I think a lot of it's like, it's very, in my opinion, it's like with venture, you're like looking for the black swan, right? You're looking for something that's the new trend. Like, and if you invest in the Me Too companies or something that already exists, that's like a red ocean where like there's too much competition. And so to me, it's always surprising when investors are like, oh, I don't invest internationally, or I only invest in SaaS companies. Or I mean, you can be, you're going to ride those waves when they happen. But if you want to be one of the greatest, venture investors, you have to always be going like to like the new industries, and the industries are being created,
And in terms of getting in touch with you, do you prefer warm intros? Do you like founders to reach out direct? What's the best way?
You can just DM me on Twitter. My
Yeah.
DMs are open. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Before I hand over to Melia, I'd love just one piece of advice. You've given so many great insights this morning already, but if you had one piece of advice to impart to the founders on the call today, what would that be?
I mean, the best advice that I think I've ever gotten is just to get started. You have to, like, if you haven't started, then you like you just got to get started building something, right? Like, and that the first step is kind of the hardest. But if it's mostly people who have started their company, then I mean, the thing that I'm really focused on, the 2 things I'm really focused on today, which I wish I had started doing earlier in my career. One is like that intrinsic versus extrinsic. So what are the things that I'm intrinsically motivated to do them? I just want to create a job where I can do as many of those things as possible and as few of the like other things, right? That's number one. And the second is like, I only want to work with people who, when I see them, it puts a smile on my face. And that's the standard of how I want to spend my time. And I think that I wish that I had those standards earlier, because I think it would help me a lot in my career.
Love that. Perfect place for me to leave it and hand over to Melia. Thanks so much for that conversation, Justin. And Mel will hit you with some audience Q&A.
Yes, we have got so many questions. I have to have the caveat, there's no way we're going to get through all of them, but thank you everyone for sending so many through. I might start with one that's come up a couple of times in different variations, which is around insights around raising capital early on. So obviously you've raised, you've also now, been an investor. Was there any insights that you would want to share around raising capital from either friends and family or angel investors, early stage investors at that early stage of running your business?
Well, so I made a YouTube video actually about raising money from investors, primarily about venture investors, but it also applies to like, your friends or relatives, rich uncles, and angel investors as well. So you check that out on my YouTube channel. But the thing I guess that is most important is, I'll summarize here, is like, it's all about storytelling. So if you want money from someone, you have to tell them a story about like why this is going to be a powerful idea that changes the world. And you need to do it in a way that they can understand. A lot of people who want to raise money expect the other person to do a lot of work to understand what they're talking about, which professional investor or not, no one's going to do, right? No one is going to do work to figure out what you're talking about. So it can be easy as a founder to really get caught in the technical details and the like, assume that people have the same knowledge that you have, but they don't, no matter who they are, how much experience they have, they don't. And so really spending a lot of time crafting a narrative that's understandable by a layperson is like probably the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can speak for both Lauren and I in that we feel very passionate about the power of storytelling here at Blackbird and Startmate. I guess to lead on from that, there's also, you touched on the idea that, after you had startup failure, there was a lot of work that you did and kind of thinking that you did to work through that. But how did that affect your positioning and your reputation for your next startup and fundraising attempt? Was there any knock-on effect that you found when you went back to raise for your next idea?
Well, the ironic thing is in Silicon Valley, a failure is almost seen as like, well, this guy has more experience, so like they're probably going to be better next time. So I was able to raise more and more money the more times I failed. I mean, I do think there was like some element of like, oh, I had some, pretty big successes in there as well. And so, that's not to discredit those. But you can't really control if you fail, you fail, and that's okay. And I wouldn't worry too much about like, can I raise money or not? It's the real important thing is like that you learn something from it and take something away from it, and then just pick yourself back up, which that can be hard. And don't be so harsh on yourself, because it's very easy to have your identity wrapped up in your company and say like, oh, I'm the cause of I failed, like I suck, I'm like not as good of an entrepreneur as the next guy or my friend who's made it or whatever. But there's just like so many extrinsic factors that go into someone succeeding or not. There's so many companies where they had like they were gonna die and then they got $1 billion acquisition, or vice versa. They had a $1 billion acquisition, they pulled it, and then they died. Like this. So there's a lot of things that go into it that are outside of your control, and being kind to yourself, I think, is just one of the most important things you can do.
Absolutely. How do you cultivate that sense of kindness and that kind of positive mindset in your team, particularly when you're all working, on a lot of deadlines across the world?
Yeah, one thing I think is really important is like having a value of gratitude, in a personal value. So for me, I'm like spend a lot of time every morning. I wake up and write down, what are the 3 things that I'm grateful for that morning, and I try to communicate that to the people around me. I mean, this is a life thing that's beyond just my team at work or something like that. But I try to tell people like, I really appreciate you for I appreciate that you whatever they do at work, in my life, and I think that just sets a culture where like people are more appreciative and have more gratitude, and like people are mimetic animals. And so they like, if you as a leader kind of come with a certain set of values like gratitude, then people copy that, and you see that behavior kind of going person to person. And I think that's like one of the things you can do to create that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to loop back on the Gen Z piece as well. We've got quite a few questions and people who share your opinion, in the view of the opportunity of the Gen Z community and demographic, I suppose. But how do you go about finding these people? I mean, you talked about the example on Discord, but how do you find people who are hungry and have the right attitude, but may not have that experience on paper? And then how do you kind of assess them? You mentioned with Brent, you had that discussion. It kind of went from there. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I like to find people where I'm pulled along by them and I learn something from them. And so, with Brent and I hired this other young woman, Jen, to run she's like the producer of my YouTube channel. And I actually didn't even want to create a YouTube channel. But she was like, really like, this is the future, you should invest in YouTube. And I was kind of skeptical, but she was just so excited about it. And I learned about YouTube from her that I was like, okay, I'll just try it, And so I like to find people where I'm learning from them, number one, and number two, they're providing momentum actually in the project or whatever it is. And so how do you find those people? I mean, for me, I just I'm willing to talk to a lot of people, especially people who like, I think a lot of people who like my partner, Robin, for example. Robin is, very successful angel investor. He's a better investor than I am actually. He's invested in Uber, Xiaomi, Twitter, and Square. And he is like, he doesn't necessarily want to talk to everybody. He's a little bit more like, he wants to find the things he's interested in and go and pursue them. For me, I'm like more, I'll talk to anybody just to like learn. I really believe in there's old Confucius saying it's like three people walk down the road, or you walk down the road with two people, and then like one of them can be your teacher. And I believe that it's like I can learn something from anybody. And so I'm willing to talk to like, random people who email me or whatever, and like try to learn something. And that I think that leads to a lot of serendipitous opportunities where there are like people who are very talented and young and maybe like don't have other, like they're not like being pursued by, Facebook or something for a job or something like that like actually are very talented that I can work with in some way.
That's amazing. And I have the feeling that your DMs might be flooded even more after this discussion.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to be, set expectations of like,
yes.
I do get a shit ton of messages and I can't respond to all of them. So,
But your DMs are open.
Yes.
I
do read most of them. I read almost everything. Yeah.
What is there any common threads of why people reach out to you? The kind of number one question you get asked.
Yeah, there's like, will you give me money is one big one. And then there's will you mentor me? And then there's one that's like, will you fund my startup? The interesting thing about the mentorship thing, which I will say, is that the best way to find a mentor, I actually made a TikTok about this the other day. It's like, people are always like saying, hey, will you mentor me, with no context? And that's like a terrible conversion rate. The conversion rate of that is like zero, right? It's like going up to someone at a bar and being like, will you sleep with me? Like, as your opening line. And that doesn't work. I can't say I've tried it, but I know it doesn't work. And so the thing you should do as the thing that's really important, it's kind of like goes back to what I was talking about with Jen and YouTube or Brent. It's like, can you teach me something? Like, can you make it an equal exchange? Not equal like you're paying me, but like I'm learning something or I'm getting something out of this, conversation, and it's like start a conversation where I'm getting something. That's like the best way to like to get someone to be your mentor, and yeah, I'm surprised at how like in effect, how bad people are at that ask.
Yeah. Do you have like a favorite question that you get asked, or the most interesting way that someone could frame that kind of question to you?
Well, I think the thing is like, how do you make it interesting to me, right? So business problems are interesting. So when someone like sends a specific question about their business, they're like, here's the context in a very concise way. I don't have to do any work to understand. I just read this thing. And then I have this specific question. then I'm like, oh, okay, I could like think about that and like answer it, because why not? If I'm already thinking about it, I'm going to answer it. Right. And that's like so much more effective than like, you know, then something else. Like, how do you make it like interesting? Or like when people try to teach you something about their business, I think that's also interesting. You know, but oftentimes people aren't really, they're not doing that. They're kind of framing it in like you should want to like you, here's what I want first, right? Rather, instead of like I'm teaching you something first, they're like, here's what I want first. But the best way to get what you want, which is probably me funding you or like, you know, teaching you about business or something, is to like make me interested first, you know.
Yeah, well,
Curious.
it comes back to that idea of storytelling, right? Like, you know,
Yeah,
take me
exactly.
on that journey, explain to me why this is interesting and why I need to get involved. Don't tell me why I should.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Look, I know we're almost out of time. I want to try and get one more question in. You spoke before about, you know, that sense of gratitude and really cultivating that in yourself and in your team. How do you balance that sense of gratitude and that being present with, you know, chasing the ambitions that you have and trying to create the world that you want to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's, you know, they're both present. You know, one thing that's present is like, oh, I'm really grateful for like everything, right? Even just breathing right here, like being able to talk to all these people on the internet, the experience that I've had, or like my house and my life, like just being able to be aware and conscious of being grateful for those things, and saying like, oh, in the future, I love for the future to look like this. And so there's some things that I want to do today and invest in today that can make that a possibility. But, you know, I'm trying to hold that very loosely, instead of what I used to do is hold it very tightly. And I'm like, if it doesn't look like this, the future doesn't look like this, I'm going to be very upset. Right. And now I try to hold it a little bit more loosely, where I'm like, oh, I want it to look like this, but like what happens will happen. And that's not to say I won't work hard or try my best to get it. But like, you know, I'm cognizant of the idea that I don't control 100% the outcome.
Absolutely. What a great response and what a great way to end this discussion. Thank you so much, Justin. I think that's all the time that we have with you today. But on behalf of Startmate, Blackbird, and everybody on the call, thank you so much for sharing your story and insights with us all. And for those listening in, if you want to get more inspiration and hear from more incredible founders across Australia and New Zealand, then join us next week at Startmate Demo Day. You can visit startmate.com.au or Startmate on Twitter for registration details, and there are free early bird tickets available until Sunday night. And remember, you can follow us for more founder events, community programming, and exclusive resources at Blackbird VC or Startmate. Thanks again, Justin. Thanks everybody for joining, and have an awesome day.
Nice, guys.